All right, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome to the Pacific Salmon Commission 22nd seminar in our series of environmental change and Pacific salmon management perspectives from both sides of the border. So today we have a very special set of speakers. We have Mike Hudson from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and we have Christine Stortini from DFO. So what's really exciting about today is that the perspectives that they're bringing to us are adapting to climate change. And we're not only it's both sides of the border, but it's both sides of the continent. So our first speaker, Mike, the title of his talk is A Rad Response to Ecosystem Transformation. A change in thinking for the change we are navigating. So Mike is originally from Illinois. He went to the University of Illinois and earned a master's in conservation genetics. And after grad school, he migrated to Utah in 1996, working on sensitive, threatened, and endangered species. In 2004, he came to work at the USFWS as the lead biologist for the native trout program. And prior to his current role, Mike spent a little over 9 years working on population assessments for native trout, biological response monitoring to tidal marsh restorations, and urban conservation. Now, as a regional chair of the climate change coordinator, Mike serves on the regional climate work group. And through these efforts, he works across service programs to better integrate climate science into the service's roles and responsibilities and communicate how we can best address our changing climate with the scope of the service's mission. As a fish biologist, Mike is part of the Passage and Habitat program and primarily works on bull trout recovery efforts in Southwest Washington and Oregon, spring Chinook, and winter steelhead recovery throughout the Willamette, as well as many other ecosystem restoration and conservation activities. So Mike is going to be speaking first, and then Christine is going to be speaking second. And her talk title is Freshwater Climate Risk Index, a case study for Atlantic salmon in Eastern Canada. So we're really excited to hear that perspective from the East Coast. So Christine is a Great Lakes-born marine biologist. She completed both her Bachelor of Science and her Master's in Environmental Studies at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and her PhD in Theoretical Marine Ecology at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. She's worked for Fisheries and Oceans Canada since 2012, and throughout her academic endeavors and since, she's been a collaborator. She's worked in the fields of geospatial vulnerability assessment to support conservation planning and fisheries managers, species distribution modeling to predict climate change related shifts in commercial species distributions, conservation planning for climate change resilience, data management, science program coordination, and strategic science planning. Since 2021, she has worked to apply a climate change vulnerability assessment originally developed for marine species to freshwater and diadromous species in freshwater ecosystems, while more broadly supporting the integration of climate change science into decision-making in Fisheries and Oceans Canada. So with that introduction, our first speaker is Mike, and I will turn it over to him to show his slides. As always, remember that we'll have our two speakers present back to back. If you could hold all your questions and enter them in the Q&A box for the facilitated Q&A period at the end of the seminar. So without further ado, Mike, take it away.
All right. Thank you, Marissa. All right. Well, thank you for asking me to join you this afternoon. I look forward to presenting this information, hearing what Christine has to say, and hopefully having a robust discussion to follow our presentations. So today, I would like to take a few minutes of your time to talk about ecosystem transformation, the RAD, or Resist, Accept, Direct framework, and their relevance to future conservation and recovery of species in their habitat, including Pacific salmon. I put my name up here not as the originator of these ideas I'm about to present, but rather as a spokesperson who also works for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm not the only one talking about RAD, and my agency is not the only one thinking about how we integrate it into our management and decision making. There are many who have contributed to the development of the RAD framework over these past several years, and there are more joining the conversation every day across federal and state natural resource agencies, tribal and indigenous partners, and others. In the past few years, there's been a lot of excitement and energy around understanding and implementing the RAD framework across these groups I just mentioned. In the Fish and Wildlife Service, we've been working to socialize and normalize RAD throughout the agency, delivering RAD webinars. We held a RAD workshop at our National Conservation Training Center in January of 2023, and this past January held another workshop to explore the intersection between RAD and structured decision making. We've been sharing the implementation of RAD in our agency with others at workshops, conferences, meetings, and seminars such as this one. And we're nearing the completion of a RAD implementation guidebook, which I'll speak more about later in this presentation. I will be just scratching the surface of this framework today. There's a lot of great supporting literature out there. And a good place to start if you're interested and you're not aware of this site yet is the USGS or US Geological Survey RAD site. So if you just Google USGS RAD, it'll probably pop up to the top of the list there. At that site, there are links to the bioscience issue from January 2022 that includes multiple articles on the RAD framework. In addition, the fisheries management and ecology issue from July 2022 that focuses on managing fisheries within a RAD framework can be found there. But why are we talking about this framework? Why was it developed? It is largely in response to this phenomenon we are seeing called ecosystem transformation. Ecosystem transformation can be defined as change that rearranges historical species composition and the ecological function of habitats. An example of this is shown here from the Kenai Peninsula in Alaska, where you can see spruce forest on the left transforming to grasslands as a result of warmer and drier conditions. Now, ecosystem transformation is not new for our planet, but the current causes are. Historically, the main driver of system change was natural climate variability, which roughly followed glacial and interglacial cycles. Now, we know most of the global change is being driven by human activities. This includes things like climate change, but also land use change, invasive species, disease habitat fragmentation, and the list continues to grow. So ecosystem transformation is not just about our changing climate, but we know that our changing climate is a threat multiplier and interacts with these other drivers. The compounding effect of these many drivers is resulting in rates and spatial scales of current ecosystem transformations that are unprecedented. One of the main challenges is the shift in the nature of drivers of transformation, which results in novel communities and increased unpredictability of system responses. So our traditional management approach, one that has relied on historical condition, may be less effective. This is why the RAD framework becomes relevant to the future of salmon conservation and recovery. The RAD framework allows us to proactively initiate the conversation about how to respond. Managers can apply any of three approaches, either alone or in combination, to address ecosystem transformation that results from changing climate or other directional drivers of change. The first option is to resist ecosystem transformations, where management actions focus on maintaining current or historical ecosystem structure and function. The second option is to accept ecosystem transformations, where managers do not intervene and allow ongoing transformations to occur. And the third option is to direct ecosystem transformation toward a specific alternative outcome, where managers accept that change is inevitable, but intervene to steer the transformation towards an ecosystem state with particular structure and function. The RAD trichotomy is useful because it encompasses the full decision space. Each option represents trade-offs among management goals, societal values, and available resources. The RAD framework also proactively incorporates adaptive management. There are multiple plausible futures, and there are multiple social and ecological trajectories within that range of uncertainty, shaped by social economic factors such as fragmentation, pollutants, demographics, economics, and values, and shaped by ecological factors such as habitat, colonization, mortality, and disturbance events. Using the RAD framework, we deliberately engage with our partners to discuss these plausible futures and the portfolio of socio-ecological trajectories that could lead to those futures. Through this process, we can collectively identify points of intervention in which actions can be implemented that either resist, accept, or direct the ecological transformation occurring. The action or actions taken depend on the socio-ecological trajectory that we find ourselves on. Utilizing the RAD framework allows managers to better allocate scarce resources, which can result in more effective conservation or restoration actions. But for an organization like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, where we have a very specific conservation mission, it can be challenging to interpret and implement a framework like RAD. The important thing in any of our cases is to recognize the challenges this approach might present to you so that you may overcome them or work around them. The following are some of the challenges we are facing as an agency. The National Wildlife Refuge System manages 835 million acres specifically for conservation. This includes 21 national wildlife refuges, which are designated as wilderness. According to the Wilderness Act of 1964, these are areas where the earth is untrammeled by humans. So there's a lot of questions about what this means for applying RAD. Can we intervene and direct these areas toward a desired future state? Or do we have to accept the trajectory those landscapes are on? Another consideration are issues that might arise from our agency's role in protecting threatened and endangered species. RAD alternatives for species protected under the Endangered Species Act may be constrained due to issues associated with critical habitat designation or our legal inability to accept the trajectory that these species are on. Related to this, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is continuously being sued over issues associated with ESA regulation. And litigation can influence decision-making and restrict management response. Another challenging aspect are potential mismatches among existing policies and future ecological landscapes. For example, current policy is unclear and inconsistent when it comes to species translocations to areas outside of historically occupied habitat, and does not account for projected range shifts. We are taking steps to address this, hoping to have a policy in place in the near future that supports conservation introductions and aligns with our recently updated rules on Section 10J of the Endangered Species Act. Other obstacles include a lack of coordination among collaborators, lack of funding or inconsistent funding, limited capacity to implement actions, changing agency priorities, conflicting regulations or prohibitions from states or other entities, and resistance from societal factions, particularly for high conflict or controversial situations. All that being said, and though formalization of the RAD framework is relatively recent, federal wildlife managers are already implementing resist, accept, or direct actions. So I'm going to spend the next few slides describing some of these, starting with resist. The Crocodile Lake National Wildlife Refuge was created to preserve nesting habitat for the American crocodile. Nesting habitat is disappearing due to sea level rise and coastal erosion, and managers are resisting by importing sand and manually building nesting areas, which requires a lot of resources. Another resist example comes from the desert Southwest, where riparian areas are being transformed by the invasion of tamarisk. Tamarisk outcompetes native riparian vegetation and impacts wildlife habitat, reducing biodiversity and further threatening endangered birds like the southwestern willow flycatcher. Federal managers across different agencies are resisting by removing tamarisk. What does accept look like? Sometimes it may be too expensive to remove invasive species, or removal efforts may be ineffective. This is the case with Phragmites, an invasive wetland grass that has taken over parts of the Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge in Maryland. Although it provides little food and shelter for most salt marsh dependent wildlife, it does provide habitat for some generalist wildlife species, and it might offset problems that rapid sea level rise pose to coastal marshes. Managers have largely accepted conversion of native salt marsh vegetation to communities dominated by Phragmites. Another example where resistance just seems futile is the northward expansion of mangrove forests along the coast of Florida. Mangrove species are native to South Florida, but the plants are rapidly moving farther north as climate change makes freezing weather less common. Salt marshes are declining due to sea level rise, with palms and other native vegetation dying from saltwater intrusion. This salt marsh ecosystem is being replaced by mangrove forests, which provide nursery habitat for fish and crabs, plus they buffer the coastline from storms. And wildlife managers at several coastal refuges have accepted this transformation. An example of how wildlife managers are directing change comes from the American burying beetle, a grassland species currently listed as threatened. Climate modeling efforts indicate that southern populations would become extirpated in the future. Managers in Oklahoma are recommending mitigating those impacts to the beetle by purchasing conservation easements farther north in Nebraska. And one final example of how wildlife managers can direct change is through the establishment of refugial populations. This has already been done for many endangered aquatic species, where species are translocated into new sites where aquatic ecosystems are created for them. An example of the latter is the establishment of spring-fed pools designed to house the Pahrump poolfish and the relic leopard frog at the Las Vegas Springs Preserve. The poolfish and the leopard frog never lived in these springs that used to occur naturally on the site. But a similar type of springfish and species of frog went extinct when those original springs were pumped dry as Las Vegas grew in the early 1960s. These examples are snapshots of specific management actions that can be taken in the larger context of the RAD decision framework. We will soon have a RAD implementation guidebook in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that will provide our staff with guidance in applying RAD. This guidebook is still in draft, so I can only talk about it generally, and unfortunately can't share a copy with you yet. However, I do want to recognize the authors of this work and the contributors to review and improvement of this guidebook over the past couple of years extends across all programs and the geographic scope of our agency. The guidebook recognizes the importance of working with others so we can co-develop effective and meaningful solutions, exploring a wider range of management responses given scenarios of climate futures and plausible ecological trajectories, and planning why, when, where, and how to strategically change our RAD management response using adaptive management. The guidebook devotes a significant portion of its guidance to application of RAD through 3 entry points at varying scopes. Those entry points are RAD menus, RAD portfolios, and the RAD decision context. The development of a RAD menu is probably the most basic approach. Think of it as brainstorming all possible adaptation actions for a given management scenario. It is what we could do, not what we should do. What does this look like in an example outside of salmon conservation and recovery? For example, in part of my world, I work in bull trout recovery. So resist could include actions like reintroduction into historically occupied habitat or non-native species removal. Accept could be doing nothing. And direct could be actions like conservation introductions into historically unoccupied habitat or managing for a new species composition. The purpose here is to look at all the options on the table. While there are examples here that are already being implemented for bull trout across their range in each of these areas of the RAD framework. The application of RAD involves intentionally thinking about all of these and other options a priori. Through spatial planning and pathway planning, we can develop spatial portfolios that include why, when, where, and how to strategically change our RAD management response using adaptive management. We can look at the range of plausible ecological trajectories and the suite of actions taken across space and time to facilitate learning and inform adaptive management. And finally, it is so important that we deliberately engage others in this new era of conservation, especially in the context of applying the RAD framework. With a broader set of values, rules, and knowledge at the table, the likelihood of co-developing a solution that works for people and the ecosystem is greater. What additional actions might be added to a RAD menu when you engage others in that process? What more can be learned from a broader set of partners across the geography that are implementing different actions across a RAD portfolio? This framework is still a relatively new way of thinking for our agency, so we do not have a fully developed set of examples or case studies to share yet. But a couple of places where we are currently working through this process include the Hanford Reach National Monument, which protects over 196,000 acres of what was once largely sagebrush steppe. We are engaging our partners there, including the state of Washington, the Department of Energy, and 4 tribal nations. Increased drought, excessive heat, and increased human development have led to wildfires with increased intensity, scope, and frequency that are transforming the ecosystem. The partners are exploring the spectrum of management actions to determine the most effective, meaningful solutions. Elsewhere, the low-lying Florida Keys are being impacted by rising seas, increasing storm events, and other climate and non-climate stressors. Here, we are engaging the Nature Conservancy, Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, the National Park Service, and the Department of Defense, with the goal of developing RAD alternatives for imperiled and endemic species in the Florida Keys that are at risk and may not be able to migrate to the mainland. Again, the partners are exploring the spectrum of management actions to determine the most effective, meaningful solutions. So what does this look like for salmon recovery? Who are the partners? What are the suite of actions? That may depend on the species, the population, the ESU, the stream, and or the community. But let's take an example. What if we're talking about a translocation following a local population extirpation? Resist could look like reintroducing a genetically and or geographically similar population. Accept may be doing nothing, but from a salmon recovery perspective, perhaps natural recolonization is still possible. And direct could be translocating another ESU or stock that may be better adapted to what is presumably a changed system. The next presentation by Christine will dive a bit deeper into a framework that can be used to help inform what actions could be taken and when. I'd like to conclude with some general suggestions about implementing RAD. First, rash decisions are rarely constructive. However, delayed action can increase the risk of irreversible change and can result in lost opportunities for resist or direct strategies. Consequently, paralysis can equate to higher cumulative economic costs, greater losses of ecosystem services, and consequences to the natural systems. To reduce uncertainties about ecological trajectories, experiments in controlled settings can be proactive. Pilot testing on management approaches is also useful before scaling up implementation. Another thing to recognize is that the options need not be mutually exclusive. A portfolio of approaches can be considered and applied across a landscape. Tipping points are another good metric for reconsidering strategies. And lastly, as present-day actions have implications for the future, bet hedging can ensure that no choice now closes a door to other options in the future. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for your time and pass the mic to Christine.
Thank you, Mike, for that informative talk. And as Christine prepares her slide and her presentation, I'd just like to remind the audience that we'll take questions at the end, and you can pose them to Mike or to Christine in the bottom of your Zoom box in the Q&A. Just click that and you can enter a question. So, Christine, you're up.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I feel very honored to be presenting to you on this work. I want to preface this that this is a project that I started in 2021 on a contract with DFO when I was working for Maritimes region, which is the East Coast region, one of the East Coast regions of Fisheries and Oceans Canada. And then I started off with doing an evaluation of vulnerabilities of freshwater and diadromous species in Nova Scotia. We then hired a master's student who expanded the work to New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island provinces, who's Megan Shin, who is listed here. And I just want to acknowledge the really amazing work that she did on this project as well, along with the other co-authors that are listed here. I also want to acknowledge that I am a marine biologist by training. And when I first started on this project, I had very limited knowledge of freshwater ecosystems. So I relied on the expertise of a lot of other people to get me up to speed. So I just, like this figure kind of shows, I feel like I'm standing on the shoulders of giants, of all these amazing people who really helped me along the way and told me what I was doing right, what I was doing wrong, what I should include and not include. So jumping into the presentation, I first wanted to give you a bit of an overview of what a climate change vulnerability assessment is. So a vulnerability assessment typically has three components, the first being exposure. So what's the magnitude of impact you expect climate change will have in a particular area on a particular species or ecosystem? And the sensitivity is the second component, and that is your species or habitat or community, whatever it is that you're assessing, already in trouble? Are there other stressors that are impacting it? Is its population size already critically low? And then the third component is adaptive capacity. Can the species, area, ecosystem, community adapt to changes in the environment? Can it shift in distribution? Does it have a life history that evolves very quickly? And is its habitat properly connected, that it can actually move to new areas? So the vulnerability assessment that we used as a basis for this work was the Climate Risk Index for Biodiversity. This was published by Daniel Boyce and a whole slew of international authors in 2022. The reason that we used this particular assessment as the basis of our work is because this is one of the only quantitative vulnerability assessments that considers the impacts of other stressors on the sensitivity of species. It is global in scale and uses big data sources, and so is generalized or generalizable to be used in a lot of different areas for a lot of different species. It was originally developed for marine ecosystems, but the ecological concepts made sense that it could be adapted for freshwater. So we started out looking at the methodology and saw which of the indices of exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity that were originally designed for marine ecosystems were transferable to freshwater and which were not. So some of the indices were removed that they made sense for the marine environment, but not so much for freshwater. And that included, there was an index for global distribution range, which didn't really make sense when we're talking about species that are typically homed to a very specific river. And the proportion of global temperature ranges within the tolerance range of a species, that was also not included because we were looking at species that typically are living in one particular river. And depth range was another index that was removed because we don't really have the data for to characterize the depth range of species in rivers. And we don't have the data to characterize the depth range of rivers at a fine spatial scale. So as I kind of mentioned before, one of the assumptions that underlied our development of this framework was that the species that we're assessing have some level of watershed fidelity. And so their vulnerability is based on the vulnerability within the watershed that we're assessing, not the global range of that species. Some indices were added to replace the ones that were removed. And these are indices of exposure, like exposure to precipitation extremes that has an impact on freshwater environments, but not so much in marine environments. And human impacts in freshwater were different from the types of human impacts that were included and assessed in the marine version of this method. And so here's the freshwater adapted crib. After a lot of consultation, these are the indices of exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity that were chosen. We made sure that there was an equal number of indices within each component to make sure that there was no bias towards one component or the other. Each of these indices, the quantitative data were collected from various sources and then scaled from 0 to 1 to obtain an index score for each index within each component. And I think the next slide. And we made sure to use generalized or widely accessible data sources in the hopes that this method could then be applied elsewhere. So this slide, the text is a little bit small in the input data, but there were many different data sources used, and I'll get into the details of those data a little bit further along in the presentation. But the idea is that you quantify each index, you calculate the average of the 4 indices in each component, as well as the standard deviation. And then when you calculate overall vulnerability from those 3 components, you add sensitivity and exposure and subtract adaptive capacity as sort of a positive feature. And then you multiply it by the inverse of the standard deviations. And that sort of allows you to weight your overall vulnerability by your level of certainty. And that is the sort of agreement of your indices within a component. And there was another step taken, which I won't get into because it would take a long time to explain, but we can get into it if someone has a question. We then took the vulnerability scores, and based on ecological understanding of the extinction risk or irreversibility implied by each index, we were able to translate those vulnerability scores into an overall risk, which was high, negligible, low, medium, high, and critical. So in my results, you'll see the vulnerability scores by primary watershed, as well as the risk scores that they were translated into. So this vulnerability assessment was conducted for a number of species in 3 maritime provinces at the primary watershed level. This also required quite a bit of consultation with experts to see if evaluating vulnerability of these species at the scale of primary watersheds was sufficient, or if we needed to dive a little bit deeper. And the general consensus was, well, the data are available mostly at that scale, and this would be sufficient for us to at least start to make some decisions about whether climate change will be a concern or not to our decisions that we need to make. So we ran this assessment for 14 species in total, which included the species listed here, but also more. The species chosen, they were chosen because they were ecologically important, recreationally fished, or culturally important. But I will focus on Atlantic salmon today because this presentation is for the Pacific Salmon Commission. But I will also include the link to Megan Shin's master's thesis because we have not published this work yet as a primary publication, but the work is available for all the species assessed in her thesis, and the link is at the end of this presentation. Okay, so diving into the methods, there were a number of indices that were directly tied to climate change projections. And this is change in temperature. We were able to obtain CMIP5 climate change projections at the primary watershed level for changes in near surface air temperature, as well as total precipitation per day from climatedata.ca. So this is an Environment and Climate Change Canada-led initiative. It's a website. You can click on a cell or a number of cells and extract the data that you need. These were collected for 3 emission scenarios. So best case scenario, most realistic middle ground scenario, and worst case scenario in terms of how we're able to mitigate our emissions into the future. And this was the CMIP5 set of models. There were 24 of them. And so for each index, we averaged the index across all 24 of those models to get an ensemble approach to calculating each of these climate projection-based indices. And because we were only able to access near surface air temperature projections, which is not ideal, but that really is all that's available currently, we decided to, and looking through the literature to try to compare and data sets from monitoring where air temperature, near surface air temperature and water temperature were collected at the same time, we decided to subtract 3 from the near surface air temperature projections in a hope that that would somehow approximate water temperature. But someday, if there are projections for actual water temperature, that would be a bit more ideal. So I'm going to explain each of the indices, how they were calculated now. So for projected habitat loss and timing of emergence from the thermal niche, these are both calculated using a projected time series of the maximum of, like over a year, the maximum monthly means of temperature projected. And so given this time series, we compared that to a species upper thermal tolerance limit, which was collected through literature search and or through FishBase, which is an online, it's a website where that sort of information about the biology of species is provided openly. And so when in that time series of projected temperatures, the temperature is predicted to exceed the species tolerance. That gives you the timing of emergence from the thermal niche. That's the second index there. We did this for all the species, and then for all of the primary watersheds. And that gave us an idea of how many watersheds the species is predicted to be absent from as of 2100, which is the projected habitat loss from our region of assessment. And then for thermal pressure or safety margin, we evaluated a hindcast of temperatures of the maximum of monthly means per year, and looked at over the past 15 years when the maximum of those maximum monthly mean temperatures was reached, how close is that temperature to our species upper thermal tolerance limit? So how close is it to having its temperature be exceeded, its temperature tolerance exceeded? How comfortable is it in this environment currently? I also forgot to mention the projected ecosystem disruption index was also based on the time series of projected temperature change, the maximum monthly mean. So that's the time of emergence plot on the left. And so for all species, we calculated when they would no longer be able to tolerate temperatures within a primary watershed. And then we saw how many of the species that we assessed would be absent from that watershed by 2100. So that's a measure of how much the ecosystem is projected to change, because that will have sort of secondary effects on our species that we're assessing. And velocity of warming was the final, or one of the final warming-based metric or index within the assessment. This is the rate at which we predict the temperature will change, but also in a particular direction. And this is a widely used index of warming in the climate change literature. The magnitude of change in extreme precipitation frequency was calculated as the average proportion of extreme precipitation days per year in the 2075-2100 time range. And this was given as the number of days within a year that exceeded the standard deviation unit of 1. And the long-term mean that this is based on was up until 2015. So the historical mean, how much an extreme was considered a standard deviation of 1 more or less than that long-term mean. Exploitation status was based on the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada's statuses of species, so endangered, threatened, special concern. And body size was taken from either local literature or fish base, as I mentioned before, which provides the maximum length of a species. And cumulative other anthropogenic stressors or cumulative impacts from other human activities. These data, as well as the amount of habitat available and the connectivity of habitat, was collected from the Nature Conservancy of Canada's data set for watershed health. It was available at the tertiary watershed, but we averaged it up to the primary watershed scale. Okay, so now I'm going to get into the results for Atlantic salmon. First, we'll look at projected habitat loss, and this is based on a maximum temperature tolerance of 20, which is a bit conservative, as I know this went through a lot of back and forth with the experts about which temperature tolerance limit to use. There are differences in temperature tolerance across life history stages. There's a maximum tolerance potentially of 28 degrees, but there's use of cool pools by these species. So that's why there would be a tolerance of 28, because they're likely going in shaded areas or cool pools. So we just used 20 degrees to be conservative and base it off of physiological limits in the lab. Here are the results for projected habitat loss by 2100. We see that under the best case and sort of middle ground scenarios of climate emissions, that salmon should still be present in all 3 provinces. But if we continue to increase our GHG emissions under the worst case scenario at the bottom, our CP 8.5, we are predicting that it should be, that the habitat should no longer be tolerable for salmon across the majority of those 3 provinces. The timing of emergence, again, under the best case scenario and middle ground scenario, we find that Atlantic salmon will not emerge from primary watersheds in the 3 provinces by 2100, but then we start to see certain watersheds emerging sooner than others under the worst case scenario. And here's those vulnerability scores translated into risk. So we see a high risk in Prince Edward Island and along the southern coast of the Gulf of St. Lawrence in Nova Scotia. Velocity of warming. This is purely not related to salmon's temperature tolerance, but just the environmentally expected rate of warming. We don't see, relative to a global scale, we don't see a drastic rate of warming in this region, although there's medium risk in some of the watersheds. Magnitude of change in extreme precipitation. There was low risk for all watersheds for all of the emission scenarios. You'll notice that there's some red in the vulnerability scores, but that's just because this scale was scaled to the areas of interest, not the global scale, which would be from 0 to 1. Exploitation status. Atlantic salmon is endangered across the majority of this area, but only threatened along the southern shore of the Gulf of St. Lawrence. It is close to its thermal limit already under, and this is using hindcasted temperature time series under the 3 scenarios. And no matter which scenario you look at, it is close to its limit already. Especially in New Brunswick. So this is at critical risk. Other anthropogenic stressors. So we found the watershed health index, which included presence of unpaved roads, impervious surfaces, non-native fish, aerial coverage of clear-cut forests, cropland, pastureland, pollution, acid deposition, and leaching. There were certain watersheds that showed up as being much more vulnerable than others, in particular the LaHave watershed in Nova Scotia, which is showing as critical risk. Projected ecosystem disruption, similar to the other results that were based on salmon's temperature tolerance, we don't find a lot of change in species presence within these watersheds under a best case and middle ground emission scenario. But if emissions do continue to increase, then we find the risk increases quite a bit and actually becomes critical risk for quite a bit of ecosystem shift and change under RCP 8.5 across the entire region. This one here was based on lethal temperature tolerance limits. But then if we changed the index to use species sublethal temperature tolerance, so a lower, and this means sort of for salmon, that would be the difference between using 28 or 20. We found it looked a little bit different. And actually, if we looked at sublethal temperature tolerance across all the species assessed, there's critical risk across all emissions scenarios. Historical thermal variability, and this is relative to the species thermal niche and how often it experiences temperatures outside of its niche. So is it pre-adapted to change? And we found that there was medium risk across the entire study area under all 3 emission scenarios. Amount of habitat, this is really based on the amount of wet area that are existing in these primary watersheds. And so you'll see the correlation on the plot. And this is basically the amount of habitat that's available to the species if they had to shift in distribution. Connectivity of habitat, we use the aquatic barriers, Canada's aquatic barriers dataset, and weighted the density of barriers, and that includes roads, dams, culverts, by their passability, if there's a fish passage or not, and how many fish passages. And we found that there was high vulnerability across the majority of this study region in terms of connectivity. So not a lot of connectivity to support shifting distributions of species in this area. And body size as a proxy for life history, Atlantic salmon has a maximum length as recorded in fish base of 150 centimeters, so it fit into the low risk category, and there's no spatial variability in this index. So overall vulnerability, combining all the index scores within each component, adding them up, and weighting by the variability of index scores. We find that Atlantic salmon overall, and this is using its sublethal temperature tolerance limit, and that's because we're combining all of the indices together, has a low risk across all of the primary watersheds in this area under the best case scenario and middle ground scenario of emissions. But again, if we do continue to increase our emissions, Atlantic salmon is at high risk, especially in Prince Edward Island and the southern Gulf of St. Lawrence. Okay, so those are the results for salmon and what this assessment can provide. The idea is that we would really like to expand this to many more areas in hopefully, if it becomes available, use water temperature. And I'll get into the caveats later and sort of hopes for the future. But if this can be applied in many different areas for many different species and perhaps automated so that you can access the data via a map, I think this information could be really important for a number of freshwater managers. So areas of low vulnerability could be protected as refuges. Low vulnerability areas where species are not currently observed could present opportunities for reintroduction. And this is based on some of the decisions that are being made for recovery of species at risk in Canada. Low vulnerability areas with high impact from other stressors might require remediation, because this area could be a climate refuge for a species if you reduce the other stressors that are impacting it. And high climate vulnerability areas with low impact from other stressors could be monitored for change, because these would be areas where the observed change would be more directly tied to climate as opposed to the other stressors. Getting into the caveats, we know that air temperature has an influence on water temperature, but in freshwater environments, we have also the influence of groundwater intrusion. And we weren't able to account for this. But we know that there are models being developed to predict water temperature based on air temperature and groundwater. And I was given this information by Antoine O'Sullivan. I won't get into the details of this, but basically it's showing that the air temperature fluctuates a lot more than river temperature because of the groundwater influence. So that's the red line versus the blue. So when he told me about his work evaluating or predicting river temperature based on groundwater influx, I realized this was something that would really need to be added in the future. Also in the future, we plan to combine our vulnerability scores from the primary watersheds with vulnerability scores from Dan Boyce's marine-based crib for our diadromous species. So we know that Atlantic salmon doesn't just exist in freshwater habitats, it also exists in the marine realm. And so it's important to evaluate vulnerability in both of the realms that it exists in, and then combine those results to help inform management in both arenas. Okay, that's it for me. And that's the link to Megan Shin's thesis. So when you have the PDF, you'll be able to access it. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that excellent talk, Christine, and to Mike as well. So we are at 2:56. So reminder, pose your questions to both speakers in the Q&A box, and we're just going to pause for about 5 minutes. That will put us back here at 2 minutes after the hour. And we'll have a facilitated question and answer period. And also a reminder that both talks will be posted to the PSC YouTube channel in a couple of days, and on the website, the PDFs of each of the talks will be available. So you can access some of those resources that Christine talked about. So we'll see you all in a few minutes.
Why don't we go ahead and start with a Q&A. And I think, Mickey, actually, do you want to start with the first question about the RAD?
Yeah, sure. This one is from Gary Morishima. RAD appears, this one is for Mike. RAD appears to involve science as well as subjective opinion of partners. However, can you clarify how RAD decision processes consider risk and uncertainty particularly in the light of accelerating pace of directional change and venturing into conditions that involve tipping points, sudden and extreme events.
Yes, I can venture into that question. We could probably have an entire seminar just on that topic, but thank you, Mickey, and thank you, Gary, for the question. I will preface what I'm about to say with there are people that are much smarter than I am that helped develop this framework and have much more eloquently documented many of these ideas in some of the literature that I've referenced in my presentation, and in our implementation guidebook that will be coming out. So one paper that I do want to just throw your way, Gary, and to the rest of the audience is was in that bioscience issue by Abby Lynch et al., RAD Adaptive Management for Transforming Ecosystems. That addresses risk and uncertainty within this framework. And I'll leave it at that. We also talk about it in our implementation guidebook. But what I'd like to just say, you know, I think in my layman's terms, is that if you go back to my presentation and there was a slide with a flashlight beam on it, and on the far right is the plausible futures, and that's describing that uncertainty, from this unknown future to this unknown future, and there's many pathways or ecological trajectories that can get us there. So what you can do within the RAD framework is scenario planning. If you picture that beam going along the ecological trajectories where you hit a tipping point or an extreme event on a given ecological trajectory, and you can say, what are my potential adaptation responses or my RAD responses at this point? And you can lay that out. Maybe you only have resist and accept, or maybe you have all three, but you lay those out, and then you can consider like what the outcome may be. And what the associated risk is. And those are qualitative conversations that you can have with your partners. But the cool thing about the RAD framework is that you can also just take this into an existing decision framework that you're comfortable using that helps you to assess the relative weights of risk and uncertainty, like structured decision making. And so you can just pull those in there and then go through something that does it in a much more systematic way. So I think that's probably the best way I can answer it at this point in time. But if that wasn't clear enough, I'm happy to provide any follow-up. And I'll drop the link to that paper in our chat, and perhaps our facilitators can share that.
Thank you, Mike. That was excellent. We'll pass it back to Lori.
Yeah, so this question's for Christine. It's also from Gary Morishima. It says, the state of knowledge is rapidly changing, including the scale, capabilities, and relationships depicted by the ensemble of available climate models. Similarly, the socioeconomic trajectory scenarios, that's a handful, change with each iteration of climate assessment. What measures are being undertaken to keep vulnerability assessments current? How do you keep up with it? Yeah,
that's a really good question. And I'm very excited that question got asked, because I've been thinking about it a lot as well. And it's something that I think a lot of people within Fisheries and Oceans Canada have been thinking about. And there's some people with the expertise to create reproducible code that pulls data through the internet and is able to be automatically updated. And I see a lot of benefit in that approach to writing out the methodology for these types of assessments, making them automated so that you can update rapidly. Because these assessments, they take a year to do if you're just doing it on your own and doing the code manually. And I think that would make it much more rapid and more updatable, and also more accessible. We could make the results more accessible. So that's what I'm hoping. We haven't done it yet. I'm hoping that we can, though. I'm going to be putting the code for this assessment on GitHub, so that it'll be openly accessible to be used and updated there. But my hope for this and other vulnerability assessments like it is that we can put them in a location with outputs that are available publicly, and there's someone behind the scenes who can rerun it on a regular basis with updated projection data. So that's, yeah, that would be my hope.
Great. Thank you for that answer. I guess for both of you, one of the questions that came up in I guess Christine, you'd mentioned it, that you could provide an example of how RAD might integrate into an adaptive management. Perhaps you'd like to elaborate on that?
Yeah, sure. Mike and I actually met yesterday or the day before, and we were talking about this. It's the climate change vulnerability assessments and the indices of those vulnerability assessments, I think, can be really useful inputs to the RAD decision framework. And I think that it's the particularly the indices that are related to the expectation of temporal change. So if we predict that a species will be extirpated because it's reached its thermal limit by a certain year, we know the time frame over which we need to make a decision, which can help us decide if now we want to resist, accept, or direct. Also, if a species is going to be extirpated from an area in the near term because it's already at its thermal limit, we're already seeing impacts. The vulnerability score is really high for a number of reasons. That might be a reason to just accept. If we see an area that is low climate vulnerability, low vulnerability from other stressors, and seems to fit the habitat requirements of your species of interest, that might be an opportunity to direct, to help move the species, assisted migration into an area. So I think that this type of information can help you decide which of those 3 actions you're going to take. Mike, do you want to add anything?
No, I think that's perfect. The thing that I was thinking about is just you know, the vulnerability assessment gives us the metrics that we can plug into the different ecological trajectories, and it can help us understand, you know, at what point, and I think you just said this, at what point do we take action depending on which ecological trajectory we find ourselves on, and that brings in other, you know, metrics and monitoring components that are necessary in order to inform that decision-making process.
Great. So we'll move on to the next question. It's actually for myself, for you, Christine. So as you mentioned, thermal tolerance can differ between different life history stages and ultimately have different ramifications to productivity and survival. Is there a consideration to further examine juvenile versus adult related survival and its component with habitat loss and potentially that they have different thermal limits?
Yeah, we thought about that. We made the decision to make it more, to get the method out there and make it more generalizable, that we would just use the adult thermal tolerance limits. But we have considered using the most sensitive life history stage and its thermal tolerance instead. And then a recent complication was just brought to me near the end of the latest iteration of the project, that Atlantic salmon could potentially, like, because they only appear 1 year and then they don't come back for another 5 years, that predicted extirpation based on temperature warming in a particular year might not even impact the particular group of salmon that you're of that year class. So I'm not really sure how to tackle the difference in groups of salmon in life history stages. Maybe the approach would be to run the assessment for each life history stage individually and look at the differences. That could be an option, and look at, because we ran the assessment for sublethal and maximum lethal temperatures and looked at the difference. And it would be as easy as that, as just changing the upper thermal tolerance limit based on whichever life history characteristic you want to assess and running it again. So yeah, I think that might be a useful additional step.
I was involved in the Crozier et al. Paper, the 2019 Pacific Salmon Viability Assessment. And another thing we considered is just when are they there? When are different stages in freshwater versus out in the ocean? And I think that's a really important one. Like spring Chinook come in, and I know you've got Atlantic salmon, or all Atlantic salmon, but certainly between the species you looked at American eels versus Atlantic salmon, when they're in freshwater versus when they're not. Sometimes some species are more vulnerable. Spring Chinook come in the spring as adults into the freshwater and often have juveniles that spend a full year versus fall Chinook, which head out immediately.
Right.
And where summer temperatures. Anyway.
That's a good point. Yeah, to do the assessment for the life history stage, that is most relevant.
Yeah. It's complicated.
Yes.
We had like 30 some people on our paper. Anyway. So
and I'm a little newbie in this realm too. Still.
Yes. Mike, when you talk about lack of policy support for RAD implementation, what are some of the pathways that we can take to address this issue?
So I feel like you guys are trying to get me in trouble by asking questions. So I want to be very clear that I'm not going to tread into the future on this and rather answer based on things that have already happened, so I can stay on solid ground here. I alluded to some policy changes that we've had and briefly mentioned them in the presentation. In general, the policy that many natural resource management agencies have had and the laws that we have to support them are rooted in, trying to get back to the historical condition, and it's really in that resist frame of the RAD framework. And so in order to broaden that and allow room for us, following these other alternatives of accept and direct, we really need to be revisiting. We can revisit our policy and perhaps look at it through a different lens. And so a few of the things that have happened in Fish and Wildlife Service in recent years, in the last few years actually, we have what's called a BIDA policy for a refuge program. It's biological integrity, diversity, and environmental health. And it was very focused on the historic condition of these refuges and the primary purpose that is congressionally authorized for these refuges. And the language has been adjusted to allow for new conservation directions potentially as the laws allow that to happen in the future. And one of those things that could happen is a conservation introduction, where we take a species that wasn't historically on that refuge or that didn't historically occupy that area and transplant it, do a conservation introduction into that refuge. And our BIDA policy previously would not allow that. It now does. So we've expanded, the potential for that action to occur by revising that policy. I mentioned the 10J rule. The recent change to our 10J rule under the Endangered Species Act has allowed us to consider experimental populations outside of the historic range of a species listed under the Endangered Species Act, which then also opens the opportunity up for conservation introductions. And conservation introductions are, I gave the example of the American burying beetle. By protecting potential habitat in the future in areas outside of that beetle's range, north north of where they are now, it gives us the opportunity to consider moving beetles up there. So it's a direct action underneath the RAD framework. And the final thing I would mention is that, what we've done is develop decision support tools around conservation introductions in the past year. Other decision support tools may help drive the development of policy that supports those and RAD actions. So in our region, we developed a decision support framework for conservation introductions, and that kind of spawned this idea and need for a policy at the national level that supports conservation introductions. And so those are some of the pathways that we've taken recently. I know there's many more, and it's definitely going to be agency and country specific, I'm sure.
Great, thank you. Christine, I had a quick question. You said that you were using body size as a life history or a proxy for life history. And I was wondering if you could just explain a little bit what you meant by that. I didn't quite catch it.
Yeah. So this is based on a somewhat proven theory, but there's some variation that larger body-sized animals and this is based on marine fish mostly, larger body-sized animals tend to live longer and have longer evolutionary processes, so that they're slower to respond to changes, slower to adapt to changes, and if they have negative impacts on their population, they're slower to recover. And smaller bodied species tend to reproduce much more quickly, so they can evolve more quickly, they can adapt more quickly. So that's the theory behind that index. I've been told that it's more complicated than that in freshwater. But I wasn't quite sure how to address the variation in how that index could be applied to freshwater species or diadromous species. So I thought, the ecological theory still applies, I think, to some extent to freshwater species. If there's a different index that could replace it, I haven't been given one yet. And if anyone here has any suggestions, I'm totally open to suggestions.
Thank you for that clarification.
So it looks like there's a question from Gary Morishima for Christine as well. It says here, the vulnerability assessments appear to be centered on persistence or risk or extirpation. Have you thought about evaluating impacts of environmental change on productivity and abundance of Atlantic salmon?
When we've published results from using this assessment, but from the marine side, we used the marine version of the crib to assess vulnerability of conservation priority species in protected areas. And when we wrote the discussion of that paper to help with the interpretation of the results, we mentioned that the vulnerability score, we can't say that just because the temperature tolerance limit has been reached that the species will not be there. There's a chance that it could still be there, but physiologically stressed. And as it approaches that temperature tolerance limit, it will likely become more and more thermally stressed, which could have impacts on productivity. So that assessment of the timeline towards reaching its upper thermal tolerance limit should give you an idea of how the productivity should decrease over time. And a higher risk or higher vulnerability means that it's closer to its limit. It's probably a little bit more physiologically stressed in that area than in another area where the vulnerability is lower. So that's the assumption, is that physiological stress caused by warming close to or beyond its thermal limit should reduce productivity. But no, there's no estimates of productivity that come out of the assessment. It's just a, should I worry? What might this look like? And the hope is maybe you would dive a little bit deeper, like, oh, it looks like it's going to be an issue in the near term. Do we need to dive deeper and look at other time series and correlate to the species productivity, or not? But it's more of a baseline based on the assumption of the connection between warming and the species tolerance.
Great, thank you.
And great question.
We've got another question for Gary for Mike. It says the recent SCOTUS decision has gutted the Chevron defense. Have you given any thought as to how this might affect the ability to utilize RAD in decision making? And I hope you understand what that means, because I don't entirely know what that is.
I do. So first, before I answer this, I have 2 assistant regional directors I report to because I'm like co-located in 2 programs. You guys have to promise to send this recording to them so that they see how I'm handling these questions, that I'm just like, oh my gosh, you guys are asking great questions that could get someone in serious trouble if they answered it wrong. So if you guys aren't familiar with the Chevron deference, it's basically the ability of the courts to give latitude to agencies on how to interpret statutes and kind of stay out of it. And what's happened now is the courts have potentially inserted themselves into making decisions that perhaps belong to the executive branch. How that all plays out, I don't know. What I will say, that in the context of RAD, it's really cool, because in order for this to go to the courts, a dispute has to come up. And if there's no dispute, then the Chevron deference isn't even going, or lack thereof, is not even going to come into play. The power of RAD, and I think the direction that our agency is trying to go in, is deliberative upstream engagement with all parties involved in decision making, so that we are pulling in everyone's perspectives, and we're dealing with those things that have the potential to impact what that final decision could be. This is where we talk about the socioeconomic and the ecological drivers and the values and the demographics of the biological population. All of this has to come into play as we're making these decisions and going into this new direction of conservation, because it is not to be taken lighthearted, and we want to make sure that we're walking together, and so I guess that's my answer to it, and hopefully it's not a softball answer to a really good hardball question, but that's what I got.
Thank you, Mike, for weaving your way through these challenging questions. So we have one final question here in the chat that I'm seeing from Marisa. If you could give us a timeline for when your RAD guidebook might be available.
I can give you a timeline. You cannot hold me to it. There has been some unexpected delays in getting this, and we had hoped that it had been out by now, but the current timeline is to have this out this fall, before the end of the calendar year at the latest. I feel like it's really close, and what helps me in having conversations with the authors is coming back from a seminar like this, or a meeting or a workshop, and others saying, hey, we'd really be interested in seeing what's in your implementation guidebook. So I will take that as permission to go to them and let them know that there's others that are interested in seeing this as well.
Great, thank you.
All right, Mike and Christine, I think that's it for our questions today. So I want to thank you both for excellent presentations and wonderful responses to all of the questions that came your way, especially the ones that were really challenging. I think that this seminar is really important to the Pacific Salmon Commission and to this seminar series. Our next steps, October 1st, the Pacific Salmon Commission with our Committee on Scientific Cooperation is hosting a workshop on climate resilient fisheries management and the Pacific Salmon Treaty. And I think the information that you presented today is absolutely relevant to those discussions. This is going to lead into more peer-to-peer learning and more discussion about confronting environmental change within the PSC community. So I thank you both so much for agreeing to be here today. We will meet again for our next seminar in the late part of October, where we'll be exploring the issue of the Columbia River rebuilding plan. So we'll have a speaker from the US and from Canada. Those speakers are yet to be decided, but we want to talk about the Columbia River Restoration Initiative and the Okanagan, Chinook, and Sockeye rebuilding plan. So Mike, that link to Abby Lynch's paper will post on the Pacific Salmon Commission website, and both of your talks as well as the slides will be available to the Pacific Salmon Commission family. So once again, thank you so much. Have a wonderful afternoon, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you all. Thank you, Marissa.
Thank
Take
you
care,
so much
Christine.
for having me.